In 1933, America woke up one morning and the gold in your pocket was a federal crime. The law said so. And the man who signed that law, Franklin Roosevelt, held a secret meeting with the Treasury Department's highest ranking official 48 hours before he signed it. The minutes of that meeting were never released, but the personal notes of one of the attendees survived. And those notes say this: the gold issue had nothing to do with the economy, nothing at all. Before we get into what it actually was about, you need to understand something. The official story is so clean, so logical, so neatly packaged that most people never question it. Depression hits. Banks collapse. Dollar weakens. Government acts. Gold gets confiscated. Economy stabilizes. Story over. Except the story isn't over, because the ban lasted 41 years. The Great Depression didn't last 41 years. The banking crisis didn't last 41 years. The dollar instability didn't last 41 years. So why did the ban last until 1974? That question has never received a satisfying answer from mainstream historians. And the reason it hasn't is because answering it honestly requires admitting something that fundamentally changes how you understand the relationship between the American government and the American people from 1933 onwards. Let me start with what actually happened on April 5th, 1933. Executive Order 6102. That's the official designation, signed by Roosevelt. And what it said in plain language was this: every American citizen who owned gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates was required to turn them in to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, 1933. In exchange, they would receive paper currency at the rate of $20.67 per troy ounce. Failure to comply carried a penalty of up to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of $10,000. 10 years in prison for keeping your own gold. Let that sit for a moment. This wasn't a wartime measure. This wasn't martial law. This was peacetime America. And the government was telling its citizens that the metal they owned, the metal their grandparents had saved, the metal that had represented real, tangible wealth for generations, was now contraband. And the justification given was the Emergency Banking Act, the economic crisis, the need to stabilise the money supply. But here is the first thing that doesn't add up. If the purpose was to stabilise the money supply, why was the exchange rate immediately changed after the confiscation was complete? In January 1934, less than 9 months after Americans had been forced to turn in their gold at $20.67 per ounce, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act, and that act revalued gold at $35 per ounce. The government had just bought gold from the American people at $20.67 and immediately revalued it at $35. That is a 69% increase in the value of the gold they had just confiscated in 9 months. If this was about stabilizing the economy and helping ordinary Americans survive the Depression, why did the government immediately profit 69% on the assets it had just forced citizens to surrender? This isn't an accident. This isn't an oversight. This is a transfer of wealth so systematic and so deliberate that it requires a different explanation than economic emergency. Now let me tell you about Carter Glass. Senator Carter Glass of Virginia was one of the most respected financial minds in the United States Senate in 1933. He had co-authored the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. He understood monetary policy at a level that most of his colleagues couldn't match. And when Executive Order 6102 came before the Senate, Carter Glass stood up and said something that was recorded in the congressional record but has never been quoted in a mainstream history textbook. He said, and I am reading directly from the record, "This is not a measure of economic recovery. This is a measure of economic control. There is a difference. Recovery returns something to the people. Control takes something from them and does not return it." Glass voted against the order. He was one of very few who did, and his objection was not ideological. It was technical. He understood exactly what the mechanism did, and he named it clearly. This takes something from the people and does not return it. He was right. The gold was never returned. When the ban was lifted in 1974, the gold that had been confiscated in 1933 was not redistributed to the descendants of those who had surrendered it. It stayed in government vaults. Fort Knox, the Federal Reserve. It was simply held for 41 years. And then, when private ownership became legal again, citizens had to go out and buy gold at market prices that were far higher than what their grandparents had received when the government took theirs. Let me now tell you about the 48-hour meeting. The personal notes I mentioned at the beginning belong to a man named James Warburg. Warburg was a banker, the son of Paul Warburg, who had been one of the principal architects of the Federal Reserve System. James Warburg served as a financial advisor to Roosevelt in the early days of the New Deal. He was present at the meeting held 2 days before Executive Order 6102 was signed, and he kept detailed personal notes of that meeting, notes that were not intended for public consumption, notes that were found among his personal papers after his death and eventually made available to researchers. What those notes describe is a conversation that has nothing to do with economic recovery. The meeting was not primarily about stabilizing the dollar. It was not primarily about the banking crisis. According to Warburg's notes, the central discussion was about control, specifically control over what he called the old system. The phrase appears 3 times in his notes. The old system. And in context, the old system does not refer to the gold standard as an economic policy. It refers to something older, something that the new financial architecture being constructed in the 1930s was specifically designed to replace. Warburg himself became disillusioned with Roosevelt's financial policies within a year of that meeting. In 1934, he testified before the Senate Finance Committee and has said something that was reported briefly in the press and then forgotten. He said, "We are in the process of forging the most complete instrument of financial control ever assembled in a modern nation. And the gold confiscation is its foundation." The instrument he was describing was the complete severing of the connection between physical wealth and currency. Before 1933, a dollar was a claim on a specific quantity of gold. It was a receipt for real metal. After 1933, a dollar was simply a dollar. Its value was whatever the government said it was. This transition from commodity-backed currency to fiat currency is presented in economics textbooks as a technical monetary policy decision made in response to the Great Depression. But Warburg's notes suggest it was something else. It was the completion of a project that had begun in 1913 with the creation of the Federal Reserve. A project whose ultimate goal was not economic stability, but economic control. And here is where this connects to something much larger than the 1933 gold ban. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The same year the income tax was established through the 16th Amendment. The same year the direct election of senators was established through the 17th Amendment. 3 enormous changes to the structure of American financial and political power, all in the same year. This is not coincidence. This is architecture. Someone designed this. And by 1933, the architecture was nearly complete. The last piece was removing gold from the hands of ordinary citizens. Because as long as ordinary citizens held gold, they held something real. Something the government couldn't devalue. Something that existed outside the system. A farmer in Iowa, with 50 gold coins in a tin box under his floorboards, had real wealth that no Federal Reserve policy could touch. After May 1st, 1933, that farmer had paper, and paper is only worth what the issuer says it's worth. Now let me tell you what happened to the gold after it was confiscated. The official story says it went to Fort Knox, and some of it did. The United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky, was constructed in 1936, 3 years after the confiscation, specifically to hold the accumulated gold. But here is something that has never been fully explained. The total amount of gold confiscated under Executive Order 6102 has never been publicly audited against what is currently held in Fort Knox. The last full independent audit of Fort Knox's gold reserves was conducted in 1953. That's over 70 years ago. Every request for a modern independent audit has been denied or deflected. In 1974, a partial audit was conducted. Partial, not full. And the methodology of that partial audit has been criticised by multiple independent analysts as insufficient to verify the actual quantity and quality of gold held. Why won't the government allow a full independent audit of Fort Knox? If the gold is there, the audit confirms it. If the gold is there, transparency costs nothing. The refusal to audit is itself a data point. It tells you something. Now let me connect this to the broader pattern that researchers in this space have been documenting for years. The 1933 gold confiscation did not happen in isolation. It happened as part of a sequence. In 1910, a secret meeting was held on Jekyll Island, Georgia. The attendees were some of the most powerful bankers in America, representatives of the Rockefeller, Morgan, and Kuhn Loeb financial interests. The meeting was held in secret. Attendees travelled under false names. The purpose was to draft what would become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act created a central bank with the power to issue currency and control interest rates. But it also did something less discussed. It created a mechanism by which the financial interests that had designed it could influence the money supply in ways that were not transparent to the public or even to Congress. The families behind Jekyll Island, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, are the same families whose representatives were in the room 48 hours before Executive Order 6102 was signed. This is not speculation. James Warburg's presence at that meeting connects directly to his father, Paul Warburg's role in designing the Federal Reserve. The Warburg family didn't design the Federal Reserve and then disappear from American financial policy. They remained embedded in it. And in 1933, they were present at the moment when the final piece of the architecture was put in place. Let me now address something that mainstream economists will object to. They will say that the gold standard was genuinely problematic, that it constrained the money supply in ways that made it impossible to respond flexibly to economic crises. that Roosevelt's actions, whatever their secondary effects, were necessary to prevent complete economic collapse. And there is some technical merit to that argument. But it misses the point entirely. The question is not whether leaving the gold standard had economic effects. It clearly did. The question is, who benefited from those effects? Because here is what happened in the decade after the gold confiscation. The families who controlled the Federal Reserve, who controlled the major banking houses, who had been present at Jekyll Island and in the room 48 hours before 6102 was signed, those families didn't suffer during the Great Depression. They consolidated. While ordinary Americans were losing farms, losing homes, losing businesses, the major financial institutions were acquiring assets at Depression-era prices. Assets that had been built over generations by ordinary families were transferred to institutional ownership during the 1930s at a scale that has never been fully documented. This is the transfer of wealth that Carter Glass was describing when he said this takes something from the people and does not return it. He wasn't just talking about gold coins. He was talking about the entire mechanism. The gold was the key. While you held gold, you held something outside the system. Something that couldn't be inflated away. Something that represented a claim on real physical value that existed independent of any government or bank. Once your gold was gone and replaced with paper, you were entirely inside the system. Your wealth existed only as numbers in accounts managed by institutions that the government and the Federal Reserve had the power to influence, freeze, inflate, or devalue. The old system that Warburg mentioned in his notes, the one the new architecture was designed to replace, was the system in which ordinary people held real wealth outside institutional control, and it was destroyed in 1933. Now let me take this further, because the 1933 gold confiscation connects to something that researchers examining the suppressed history of the old world have been pointing to for years. The architecture of the modern financial system, the Federal Reserve, fiat currency, centralized banking control, was not built from scratch in 1913. It was built on top of something. And what it was built on top of was a prior system of exchange and value that operated on completely different principles. There is a pattern in the historical record that becomes visible when you look at the 1800s carefully. Before approximately 1860, the financial records of most American cities are incomplete in ways that don't make sense if those cities were simply growing frontier settlements. Census records begin rather than continue. Banking records start rather than resume. Genealogical lines dead end in ways that suggest not just death, but disappearance. And the architecture visible in photographs from before 1880, the grand neoclassical buildings, the ornate postal facilities, the elaborate train stations in cities that had supposedly been wilderness 20 years earlier, that architecture does not match the available labour and material capacity of the era. Someone built those buildings, and whoever built them was operating within a financial system that had nothing to do with the Federal Reserve or fiat currency. Because you cannot build a marble post office in a frontier town using a banking system that didn't exist yet. The prior civilization, the one that researchers have spent years trying to document and name, operated with real physical wealth, gold, silver, metal that held value independent of any issuing authority. And the transition to the modern financial system, the one that culminated in 1933, was specifically designed to sever that connection, to replace real wealth with paper wealth, to replace independence with dependency. Because as long as people held gold, they held a piece of the old system, a piece of something that existed before the reset, a claim on value that predated the Federal Reserve, predated the income tax, predated the entire architecture that was assembled between 1910 and 1933. The 1933 gold confiscation was the final step in a process that began decades earlier. The step that completed the transition from the old world's financial system to the new one. And it was accomplished not through honest policy debate, but through manufactured crisis, secret meetings, and legal coercion backed by the threat of 10 years in federal prison. Let me now tell you about the people who didn't comply, because not everyone turned in their gold. Estimates vary, but researchers who have examined the Federal Reserve's own records suggest that the actual amount of gold surrendered under Executive Order 6102 was significantly less than the total gold in private circulation at the time. Millions of Americans simply kept their gold. Some buried it, some hid it in walls, some moved it out of the country, and the government knew this. The prosecution of non-compliers was selective and strategic. A few high-profile cases were pursued to demonstrate that the law had teeth, but a systematic door-to-door search for hidden gold was never conducted. Why not? One possible reason is that a systematic search would have revealed something uncomfortable: the scale of non-compliance. If millions of Americans defied a direct federal order backed by 10-year prison sentences, that's a political problem. Better to prosecute selectively and maintain the fiction of widespread compliance than to expose the reality of mass defiance. But there's another possible reason. The people who designed Executive Order 6102 may not have needed total compliance. They may have needed enough compliance to complete the financial architecture, enough gold flowing into the Federal Reserve vaults to establish the new system. The rest, the gold hidden under floorboards and in barn walls and in foreign accounts, that gold was outside the system and would remain there, irrelevant to the operation of the new financial order. What mattered was breaking the psychological and legal connection between ordinary Americans and gold as a form of wealth. Once that connection was broken, once gold was legally contraband for 41 years, an entire generation grew up with no lived experience of gold as money. By 1974, when the ban was lifted, the people who had grown up using gold as currency were old or dead. The new generation had grown up with paper, and paper felt normal. The transition was complete. Now let me address the 41-year number directly because it matters more than it might seem. 1933 to 1974. Why 1974 specifically? What changed in 1974 that made gold ownership safe to legalise again? The answer connects to something that happened in 1971. In August 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window. What that means is that before 1971, foreign governments could exchange their US dollars for gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce that had been established by the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. After August 1971, they couldn't. The dollar was fully severed from gold internationally. The last external check on American monetary policy, the ability of foreign governments to demand gold for dollars, was eliminated. And once that was done, once the dollar was fully fiat both domestically and internationally, private gold ownership in America was no longer a threat to the system. because the system no longer needed gold to function. It ran entirely on confidence, on the belief that dollars were worth something because the government said they were. Gold became just another commodity, something you could buy and sell, but that had no power to challenge the fundamental architecture of the financial system. So the ban was lifted in 1974. Not because the government had a change of heart, not because of a principled commitment to property rights, but because gold had been successfully neutralized, stripped of its role as alternative currency, reduced to a collectible. And by 1974, most Americans had forgotten that it had ever been anything else. This is how the old system ends. Not with a dramatic collapse, not with a visible overthrow, but with a 41-year process of legal prohibition followed by strategic legalization at the moment when the prohibition was no longer necessary. The thing being controlled is neutralized before the control is released. And the population living under the released control has no memory of what the control was designed to prevent. They don't know what gold meant before 1933. They don't know what it meant to hold real wealth outside the system. They don't know what Carter Glass was warning about when he stood on the Senate floor and said this takes something from the people and does not return it. They only know that gold is something you can buy in a jewelry store or trade on a commodity exchange. The living memory of the old system is gone. And that, more than any economic policy, is what Executive Order 6102 was actually designed to accomplish. James Warburg understood this. He helped design it. And by 1934, he was horrified by what he had helped create. His Senate testimony that year reads, like a man trying to warn people about something he himself had set in motion. We are forging the most complete instrument of financial control ever assembled. He said it in public. It was recorded. And it was forgotten within weeks because the instrument he was describing was already operational. The press that might have amplified his warning was already operating within the financial system he was warning about. The banks that might have faced scrutiny were already the banks that the new system was designed to protect. The warning disappeared not because it was suppressed, but because the system it was warning about had already made suppression unnecessary. When the system controls the context in which information is evaluated, warnings about the system don't need to be censored. They just don't land. They exist, but they don't connect. They are recorded in the congressional record and forgotten within weeks. Just like Carter Glass's objection. Just like the 48-hour meeting that Warburg attended and documented in notes that sat in a box for decades before anyone read them. The notes exist, the record exists, the pattern exists. And once you see it, once you understand what Executive Order 6102 was actually part of, the economic crisis justification doesn't hold. It never held. It was a cover story for the final stage of a financial transition that had been planned and executed over decades by the same families that appear at every critical node of that transition. Jekyll Island, 1910. Federal Reserve Act, 1913. Executive Order 6100 to 1933. Bretton Woods, 1944. Nixon Shock, 1971. Each step building on the last. Each step moving further from a system where ordinary people held real wealth outside institutional control, and further toward a system where all wealth exists inside institutions that the same families have controlled since before your grandparents were born. The gold in the tin box under the floorboard was the last piece of the old world that ordinary people carried into the new one. And on May 1st, 1933, they were told to hand it over. Most of them did, because the law said so. Because 10 years in federal prison is a powerful incentive. Because they trusted that the government, acting in a time of genuine crisis, was acting in their interest. They were wrong. Not because the crisis wasn't real. The depression was real. The banking collapse was real. But the response to that crisis was designed not to help the people suffering through it, but to complete a transition of financial power that the people suffering through it had no knowledge of and no ability to resist. The crisis was the opportunity. The opportunity was used. And the world that came out the other side was one where the connection between ordinary people and real physical wealth had been permanently severed. Carter Glass saw it. James Warburg helped build it and then tried to warn about it. And the notes from the 48-hour meeting, the ones that were never meant to be public, the ones that sit in an archive that most people will never think to search, those notes say what the official story has never said. This had nothing to do with the economy. It had everything to do with control. The gold is gone. The old system is gone. And the world built on top of what was taken from your grandparents is the world you were born into and told was always how things worked. It wasn't. There was something before, and they made it illegal to hold on to it.